Hello. First of all, I want to thank again Carl and Nancy for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here because I've read the books of the people in this table, or they're in my reading list, or I've used them when I'm teaching. So it's really nice to be here. And I also thank them for inviting me because I haven't really been part of the genesis of the project. So in a way, but nevertheless, I've already, I think, profited from it. I knew Mikael's blog before the project took shape, so I was already aware of that blog, for example, and I was reading it very avidly and getting to know about different books of which I was not aware. So in terms of my own trajectory and where it fits with the stuff we're talking about, I'm going to echo some of the things that Mariana said and some of the things that Mikael said too. So I just finished a dissertation on urban growth and urban planning in Mexico City. And as somebody studying in the US Latin American history, I in a way was placed within a kind of a Mexican history at the University of Chicago. So most of my conversations took place within this field of Latin American history. So I was talking with colonialists, and I was talking with people studying mostly Mexico and Brazil. So that was part of the audience that I had, and it was the most important audience that I had. And when I was thinking about the questions that I was asking for my dissertation and the intellectual questions that I had, the responses that I often received from people studying Mexican history were always about the Mexican main political party, the PRI, because most of the research that I was doing in a way kind of touched this moment in Mexican history, Mexican political history, but those were not the most important questions for me. And then at the same time, I was engaging in a parallel, in a way, conversation about urban planning and about urban history, mostly among Americanists. So I was part of this the Newberry Library, the dissertation group. But it's mostly urban historians who are writing histories about Chicago and Philadelphia and New York. And then I was part of different urban studies groups at Chicago, but mostly dominated by Americanists. So my conversation with this group was always like kind of asymmetrical, because on the one hand I had to kind of learn a lot of the urban history of the US, but they did not have the equal knowledge of the urban history of Mexico. But also at the same time, there's much more books about urban history in the US than in Mexico. It's a much wider field. So then the other problem is that when I'm thinking about the type of questions and the conceptual problems, and also the writing that one has to use when one is writing about cities, it's always kind of American models or European models, and it's like the usual suspects, the kind of defining books that one reads, and then one kind of wants to write these books. But I found that there were not so many models of the books that I wanted to write and to read in Mexico or even in Latin America. So that was the first, that was my situation as I was doing my research for my dissertation. So I finished my dissertation, which is about urban planning in Mexico. And by the way, I was many times throughout my career, I was part of panels that were always about kind of the dissemination of knowledge, the dissemination of planning knowledge from Europe and the US to Latin America. This morning I was in a panel with a similar theme. And these panels helped me a lot to think about what I was doing and about the history of planning. But I've increasingly found limitations with this idea of, in a way, rewriting the history of slums and suburbs and housemanization and modernism and how this works in different places, and then seeing how these ideas actually, in a way, they're changed in a local context. And this type of research is research that I've done, but at the same time I found like limitations to it. And it wasn't until I had my defense of my dissertation that I realized that the questions that I initially asked were, in a way, questions, they were the questions of, in a way, American urban planners and people writing about mostly cities in Europe and the US. And I was able to finish the dissertation, and there's very satisfying answers in that dissertation, but I realized that there was like a path dependency in the questions that I originally asked. And it wasn't until the end that I realized that I did not have, in a way, enough models of other cities that I knew. I didn't have enough information about cities in other places, in what some people call the global south. I don't really like the name, but I needed to read more about places like in India and in a lot of other places in order to kind of get at the question that I wanted to understand. That is, it has to do with kind of urban growth and who is controlling and shaping a city as it is growing out, and how this is experienced by people in the ground. And thinking about suburbs or global suburbs and slums, and thinking about modernism and garden cities, this was not enough, and it helped me to start. But right now, I would ask very different questions. Now, how to ask these other questions, that's something that I would like this kind of group to help me think about. So think about new questions, and in a way, as Mariana was saying, like new narratives. Now, I know that it's very risky to think about kind of grand narratives, because they're always gonna, in a way, fail, and there's always gonna be problems with them. But I do think it is very difficult for somebody writing the history of a place like Mexico City to try to come up with, in a way, a grand narrative that in a way can inspire people writing the history of cities in other places in the world. So those were the questions, and in a way the conundrums that I was facing as I was writing my dissertation, as I'm reckoning with its, in a way, with its limitations and its failings too. But so yeah, so stepping back again, yeah, I think that in a way the group, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what Carl was saying when he was thinking about cities as being as impacting kind of larger processes in the world. So that's a part of it. But I also think that having different narratives, different plots, and also different questions, I think that's what I would like to have as models, as kind of interlocutors to have. And the only way to do that, of course, is reading more broadly, talking with people who live in different continents, speaking different languages, of course. So all of these challenges are very real, and I think they explain the reason why we write the urban histories that we write. But I think it's a very important challenge to embrace. So I'll just leave it there. And